Chapter 2. The theory of the average rate of profit and of the price of production. That result is as follows. The quote, organic composition, end quote, of the capital is for technical reasons necessarily different in the different, quote, spheres of production, end quote. In various industries which demand very different technical manipulations, the quantity of raw material worked up on one working day is very different, or even when the manipulations are the same and the quantity of raw material worked up is nearly equal, the value of that material may differ very much, as for instance in the case of copper and iron as raw materials of the metal industry, or finally the amount and value of the whole industrial apparatus, tools, and machinery which are utilized by each worker employed may be different. All these elements of difference, when they do not exactly balance each other, as they seldom do, create in the different branches of production a different proportion between the constant capital invested in means of production and the variable capital expended in the purchase of labor. Every branch of economic production needs consequently a peculiar, quote, organic composition, end quote, for the capital invested in it. According to the preceding argument, therefore, given an equal rate of surplus value, every branch of production must show a special rate of profit, on the condition certainly which Marx has hitherto always assumed, that commodities exchange with each other, quote, according to their values, end quote, or in proportion to the work embodied in them. And here Marx arrives at the famous rock of offense in his theory, so hard to steer past that it has formed the most important point of dispute in the Marxian literature of the last 10 years. His theory demands that capitals of equal amount but of dissimilar organic composition should exhibit different profits. The real world, however, most plainly shows that it is governed by the law that capitals of equal amount, without regard to possible differences of organic composition, yield equal profits. We will let Marx explain the contradiction in his own words. Quote, we have thus shown that in different branches of industry, varying rates of profit are obtained according to the differences in the organic composition of the capitals, and also within given limits according to their periods of turnover, and that therefore, even with equal rates of surplus value, there is a law or general tendency, although only for capitals possessing the same organic composition, the same periods of turnover being assumed, that the profits are in proportion to the amounts of the capitals, and therefore equal amounts of capital yield in equal periods of time equal amounts of profit. The argument rests on the basis which has hitherto generally been the basis of our reasoning, that commodities are sold according to their values. On the other hand, there is no doubt that in reality, not reckoning unessential, accidental, and self-compensating differences, the difference in the average rate of profit for different branches of industry does not exist, and could not exist without upsetting the whole system of capitalist production. It appears, therefore, that here the theory of value is irreconcilable with the actual movement of things, irreconcilable with the actual phenomenon of production, and that on this account the attempt to understand the latter must be given up, end quote. How does Marx himself try to solve this contradiction? To speak plainly, his solution is obtained at the cost of the assumption that from which Marx has hitherto started, that commodities exchange according to their values. This assumption Marx now simply drops. Later on, we shall form our critical judgment of the effect of this abandonment on the Marxian system. Meanwhile, I resume my summary of the Marxian argument and give one of the tabular examples which Marx brings forward in support of his view. In this example, he compares 5 different spheres of production, in each of which the capital employed is of different organic composition, and in making his comparison, he keeps it first to the assumption which has been hitherto made, that commodities exchange according to their values. For the clear understanding of the following table, which gives the results of this assumption, it must be remarked that C denotes constant capital and V variable capital, And in order to do justice to the actual diversities of daily life, let us assume with Marx that the constant capital employed are, quote, worn out, end quote, in different lengths of time, so that only a portion and that an unequal portion of the constant capital in the different spheres of production is used up in the year. Naturally, only the used up portion of constant capital, the used up C, goes into the value of the product, while the whole employed C is taken into account in reckoning the rate of profit. And I'm going to repeat that. Naturally, only the used up portion of constant capital, the, quote, used up constant capital, end quote, goes into the value of the product, while the whole, quote, employed constant capital, end quote, is taken into account in reckoning the rate of profit. We see that this table shows in the different spheres of production where the exploitation of labor has been the same, very different rates of profit corresponding to the different organic composition of the capitals. But we can also look at the same facts and data from another point of view. Quote, the aggregate sum of the capital employed in the 5 spheres is 500. The aggregate sum of the surplus value produced is 110. And the aggregate value of the commodities produced is 610. If we consider the 500 as a single capital, of which the different capitals 1 to 5 form only different parts, just as in a cotton mill in the different departments in the carding room, the roving room, the spinning room, and the weaving room, a different proportion of variable and constant capital exists, and the average proportion must be calculated for the whole factory. Then in the first place, the average composition of capital of 500 would be, of that 500, 390 going to constant capital and 110 going to variable capital, or in percentages, 78% constant capital and 22% variable capital, taking each of the capitals of 100 as being 1/5 of the aggregate capital. Its composition would be this average of 78 constant capital plus 22 variable capital, and likewise to every 100 would accrue as average surplus value 22. Therefore, the average rate of profit would be 22%. Now, at what price must the separate commodities be sold in that each of the 5 portions of capital should actually obtain this average rate of profit? The following table shows this. In it has been inserted the heading, quote, cost price, end quote, by which Marx understands that part of the value of commodities which makes good to the capitalist the price of the consumed means of production and the price of labor power employed, but yet does not contain any surplus value or profit, so that cost price's amount is equal to variable capital plus used up constant capital. Quote, taken together, end quote, comments Marx on the results of this table, quote, commodities are sold 2 plus 7 plus 17 equal to 26 over their value, and 8 plus 18 under their value, so that the variations in price mutually cancel each other out, either through an equal division of the surplus value or by cutting down the average profit of 22% on the invested capital to the respective cost prices of the commodities. Capitals 1 to 5 in the same proportion in which one part of the commodities is sold over its value, another part will be sold under its value. And now their sale at such prices makes it possible that the rate of profit for 1 to 5 should be equal, 22%, without regard to the different organic compositions of the capital 1 to 5. End quote. There's charts here of the different capitals from 1 to 5 with their varying compositions. You know, some have I guess it's a low organic composition of capital, which means that the portion of they're highly labor intensive, and another with a high organic composition of capital, which means they're very constant capital intensive. And there's showing the different ways in which despite having different amounts of labor represented by variable capital, they all receive the same profit. So, yeah. But just the reason I'm saying that is just because I'm not going to read out these two charts here because that would be tedious. I would lose focus, and anybody listening to me would also lose focus. So, just going to read. Marx goes on to say that all this is not a mere hypothetical assumption, but absolute fact. The operating agent is competition. It is true that owing to the different organic composition of the capitals invested in various branches of production, quote, the rates of profit which obtain in these different branches are originally very different, end quote. But, quote, these different rates of profit are reduced by competition to a common rate which is the average of all these different rates. The profit corresponding to this common rate, which falls to a given amount of capital, whatever its organic composition may be, is called average profit. The price of a commodity which is equal to its cost price plus its share of the yearly average profit of the capital employed, not merely that consumed in its production, regard being had to the quickness or slowness of turnover, is its price of production, end quote. This is in fact identical with Adam Smith's natural price, with Ricardo's price of production, and with the prix nécessaire of the physiocrats. And the actual exchange relation of the separate commodities is no longer determined by their values, but by their prices of production, or as Marx likes to put it, quote, the values change into prices of production, end quote. Value and price of production are only exceptionally and accidentally coincident, namely in those commodities which are produced by the aid of a capital, the organic composition of which chances to exercise value and price of production are only exceptionally and accidentally coincident, namely in those commodities which are produced by the aid of a capital, the organic composition of which chances to coincide exactly with the average composition of the whole social capital. In all other cases, value and production price necessarily and in principle part company. And this meaning is as follows. And his meaning is as follows. Marx's meaning. According to Marx, we call, quote, capitals which contain a greater percentage of constant and therefore a smaller percentage of variable capital than the social average capital, capitals of a higher composition. Hey, I was right. I remembered my terminology. Throwing the horns up right now. No one can see me, but I'm throwing the horns up. Sorry, let me repeat that. And his meaning is as follows. According to Marx, we call, quote, capitals which contain a greater percentage of constant and therefore a smaller percentage of variable capital than the social average capital, capitals of higher composition, and contrariwise those capitals in which constant capital fills a relatively smaller and the variable a relatively larger space than in the social average capital are called capitals of lower composition, end quote. In all these those commodities which have been created by the aid of capital of, quote, higher, end quote, composition than the average composition, the price of production will be above their value, and in the opposite case it will be under the value. Or commodities of the first kind will be necessarily and regularly sold over their value, and commodities of the second kind under their value. The relation of the individual capitalist to the total surplus value created and appropriated in the whole society is finely illustrated in the following manner. Quote, although the capitalists of the different spheres of production in selling their commodities get back the value of the capital used up in the production of these commodities, they do not thereby recover the surplus value, and therefore profit created in their own particular spheres by the production of these commodities, but only so much surplus value, and therefore profit as falls by an equal division to every adequate part of the whole capital. from the total surplus value or total profit which the entire capital of society has created in a given time. In all the spheres of production taken together, every 100 of invested capital, whatever its composition, secures in every year or other periods of time the profit which for this period falls due to a 100 as a given part of the total capital. So far as profit is concerned, the different capitalists are in the position of simple members of a joint stock company in which the profits are divided into equal shares on every 100, and therefore for the different capitalists vary only according to the amount of capital invested by each in the common undertaking, according to the relative extent of his participation in the common business, according to the number of his shares. End quote. Capital Volume 3. Total profit and total surplus value are identical amounts, and the average profit is nothing else, quote, than the total amount of surplus value divided among the amounts of capital in every sphere of production in proportion to their quantities. End quote. An important consequence arising from this is that the profit which the individual capitalist draws is clearly shown to arise not only from the work performed by himself, but often proceeds for the most part, and sometimes entirely, for example, in the case of mercantile capital, from laborers with whom the capitalist concerned has no connection whatsoever. Marx, in conclusion, puts and answers one more question, which he regards as the specially difficult question: in what manner, quote, does this adjustment of profits to a common rate of profit take place, since it is evidently a result and not a starting point, end quote. Marx first of all puts forward the view that in a condition of society in which the capitalist system is not yet dominant, and which therefore the laborers themselves are in possession of the necessary means of production, commodities are actually exchanged according to their real value, and the rates of profit could not therefore be equalized. But as the laborers could always obtain and keep for themselves an equal surplus value for an equal working time, that is, an equal value over and above their necessary wants, the actual existing difference in the profit rate would be, quote, a matter of indifference, just as today it is a matter of indifference to the hired laborer by what rate of profit the amount of surplus value squeezed out of him is represented, end quote. Now, as such conditions of life in which the means of production belong to the worker are historically the earlier, and are found in the old as well as in the modern world, with peasant proprietors, for instance, and artisans, Marx thinks he is entitled to assert that it is quite in accordance with the facts to regard the values of commodities as not only theoretically but also historically prior to the prices of production, end quote. Capital Volume 3. In societies organized on the capitalist system, however, this changing of values into prices of production and the equalization of the rates of profit which follows certainly do take place. There are some long preliminary discussions in which Marx treats of the formation of market value and market price with special reference to the production of separate parts of commodities produced for sale under conditions of varying advantage, and he expresses himself as follows very clearly and concisely on the motive forces of this process of equalization and on its mode of action. Quote, if commodities are sold according to their values, very different rates of profit are obtained. Capital withdraws itself, however, from a sphere with a low rate of profit and throws itself into another sphere which yields a higher profit. By this continual interchange, or in a word, by its apportionment between the different spheres, as the rate of profit sinks here and rises there, such a relation of supply to demand is created as to make the average profit in the different spheres of production the same, and thus values are changed into prices of production, end quote.